Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, good morning, everyone. Hey, nice to see you. So the name of my talk is Production, Consumption and Salvation, Considering Virtue and Attention in the Age of the Digital. So I want to begin just by asking some questions, keeping it interactive as we've been sitting for an hour. So put your hand up, and you can do the same if you're online as well. Put your hand up if you use social media. Okay, everyone. Okay, keep your hand up if it's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. I'm surprised YK2 generation. YouTube. Okay. Now put your hand up if you use social media to promote your work. Okay. And put your hand up if your livelihood depends at least partially on social media. Okay. So that's very interesting, and especially with academics, I think, as well. I didn't put Twitter, but I know that's popular. So let me begin with a disclaimer. This is very much the early stages. It's not even research, it's some reflections, let's say. And yeah, I hope that this can be the start of a conversation, particularly relevant for those of us who are using social media in this age of the hyperdigital. So social media has exacerbated new forms of connectedness, but also of separation. As we increasingly pursue community knowledge and selfhood online, there is nonetheless a cloudedness to our calls, for the salvation that new media once promised us has in fact failed. While John Maynard Keynes predicted that technological advancements would result in 15 hours working weeks, the rest of our time to be dedicated to leisure by 2030, the opposite seems to be the case. The shrinking of time and space, so characteristic of the digital age, allows us to be contactable at an instant, but has created ever new pressures that we feel on a daily basis. The never-ending string of emails, to-do lists, the bureaucracy, and the sense that we could always be more, do more, be more productive, better, growing and showing off, not to mention the pressures young people face on social media and the spread of misinformation via dark web values and practices. It is undeniable that new media is changing the way we are, shaping us. By arguing that the central characteristic of the post-digital, or perhaps hyper-digital, is a blurring of distinctions between work and leisure, production and consumption, for all digital participation is a form of labor and leisure, at once consumptive and productive. This paper seeks to situate the crisis we face today through the framing of virtue ethics, following Alistair McIntyre's 1981 book, After Virtue. Criticizing neoliberal modernity and the crisis of virtue that is embedded within its anthropology, McIntyre's thesis has had huge implications for many fields, but it is now more than ever in the age of the digital that his theory needs rethinking and reapplying. So in this paper, I'm going to outline and apply his theory to the world of the digital age, and in particular, social media. First, I will suggest that while a notion of virtue ethics is imperative for thinking about the crisis of the digital age in late modernity, we must also counter it with a focus on embodied processes of attention. For it is our attention that becomes the most valuable commodity in the digital age. To this end, I will call on Simone Weil and Michal, the name I can never pronounce, Michal Csikszentmihalyi, something like that, to think about the relationship between attention, effort, and flow in a digital age and their implication for virtue ethics. Okay. So in After Virtue, Alistair McIntyre posits a theory of virtue deeply intertwined with several other concepts: tradition, practice, roles, institutions, and perhaps most importantly, the good. We will expand on his argument a little further along when applying it to the digital age, but a brief summary posits that roles help us define specific goods, that is, through specific practices, and that through specific practices, one is orientated towards specific goods. The argument is not only ideal, but historical, or at least claims to be. For virtue ethics is always historically situated and context specific. Indeed, McIntyre argues that in heroic times, virtue was vastly defined through roles. For the warrior, the carpenter, and the mother all seek to excel in their specific practices, which are orientated towards different notions of the good that define that role in its essence. And here we may draw a parallel with the Dharmic traditions of proto-Hindu religion, as found, for example, in the Bhagavad Gita and Laws of Manu. A little later, he argues that virtue is defined communally. For Aristotle, man is a citizen of the polis. The good is that which is good for the polis. Not so much for women and slaves. And with the New Testament, virtue becomes less about roles and more this universalism, so no longer reserved for the freedman or citizen, but encouraging new collective virtues such as humility and charity. Thus, for McIntyre, morality is always tied to some degree to the socially local and particular, which is at once situated within its own history, understood as tradition, and articulated through story, memory, myth. But modernity faces a crisis. For modernity aspires to pursue virtue universally free from context and all particularity, defined by McIntyre as, quote, the capacity to detach oneself from any particular standpoint, to view and judge that standpoint from the outside. Within liberal modernity, we first have a notion of universal moral laws free from context and universally applicable. Yet, for McIntyre, such modern moral claims are illusory. For, I quote, there is no way to possess the virtues except as part of a tradition in which we inherit them. And indeed, while it is true that tradition has come to possess a bad name in liberal mainstream society, although a neo-traditionalist revival may challenge that, we must ask, is modernity not a tradition? Indeed, it is. But even in seeking to transcend tradition, modernity nonetheless remains rooted in a history which is itself tradition. Yet in seeking to transcend tradition and context situatedness, we must ask, how is virtue now understood? So McIntyre writes, whenever the virtues begin to lose their central place, Stoic patterns of thought and action at once reappear. Within this Stoic vision, the good man is a citizen of the universe. His relationship to all other collectives, to the city, kingdom, or empire, is secondary and accidental. This atomism is the caricature of the individual within modernity, whose pursuits of virtue are individualist, selfish, and non-committed. But to what extent is this trope accurate or indeed useful today when we are considering the dilemma of the digital? Our contemporary lives, as we have seen at the beginning, are mediated by digital technology that did not exist in McIntyre's day. Digital media has given us the ability to form community, belong, and relate, as much as it encourages us to see ourselves as monad individuals. Yet, while McIntyre's historically generalizing approach may and has been questioned, it is on pragmatic grounds that I argue for his utility. So let us reflect on the following quote, where McIntyre argues for the necessity of a revival of Aristotelian virtue in the medieval period. The problem at this time, he writes, was about, I quote, how to educate and civilize human nature in a culture in which human life was in danger of being turned down by the conflict of too many ideas. Too many ideas, too much information. In the age of information underpinned by economies of now fragmented attention, this is why we need virtue ethics, to ask the question, how do we educate and civilize human nature in a culture in which human life is in danger of being overwhelmed by the conflict of too many ideas and too much information? Indeed, too many choices and questions, which leave us more confused when asking, what does it mean to live a good life? Okay. So in the rest of this paper, I would like to explore McIntyre's theory in relation to the digital age. As mentioned in the introduction, McIntyre defines virtue around notions of tradition, roles, practice, and the good. So let us begin with an analysis of virtue via these concepts in regard to the digital age. Okay. So tradition. As we have already established, modernity is defined by a liberal tradition which seeks to erase tradition from itself. We might also posit, as Timothy Jenkins has, that contemporary modern culture is inherited from Christianity and the Protestant work ethic, the parent of modern capitalism, the way that Weber so famously described. Within this tradition, the individual is sacred, all are or should be equal, and they are also free. In a digital age, this freedom is heightened in some respect, as we have more freedom to decontextualize ourselves from our tradition, our personal histories, through self-presentation and realization online. At the same time, it's easier to discover and search for new information. Knowledge is simultaneously easily freed from its own rootedness in tradition. This is one reason it is so easy for us to pick and mix from different traditions, religious or otherwise. For truly committing to a tradition takes time, energy, money, and commitment, resources which are spread further in a globalized and digital world. As an additional consequence, traditional traditions risk being eroded or contaminated because there are less apprentices to tradition taking the long road. Instead, there are many more voyeurs passing through with that detachment so aptly described by MacIntyre. Roles. The rise of individualism, equality, and liberty offers us the promise to evade tradition and the roles it bestows on us. No longer must we be boxed in. We have a choice and freedom to define ourselves. And this is catalyzed online, for we can disembody and adopt new or several new identities as we interact through the screen. So these 2 points on tradition and roles, I think MacIntyre would agree with. The symptoms are perhaps intensified by the digital, but they are prevalent in pre-digital modernity too. We still have lives off screen. We still have to adopt roles in some respect in our lives, even online, in relation to how we present ourselves, the idea that these conform to how others make sense of the world. But the digital does not, however, shift our whole being in the same way it does when we think about practice and the good. So MacIntyre defines practice as, I quote, any coherent and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized. Practices are simultaneously where virtues are defined, albeit incompletely, and where they are realized. They allow humans to achieve excellence, understand and clarify value. Accordingly, planting an aubergine is not a practice, neither is performing a tree pose in yoga, but farming and gardening are, as is yoga itself, they are practices. So practices are intimately related to notions of the good. And according to MacIntyre, there are 2 types of goods, internal goods and external goods. External goods pertain to secondary reward, fame, property, status, and wealth. And these goods are generally material and limited. On the other hand, internal goods seem to gesture to something immaterial, even ineffable, good for the whole community, the drive to excel, the embodied spirit of goodness of pursuing excellence. We might liken the experience of excelling in a practice orientated towards a specific yet ineffable good as to what the psychologist Mahal Csikszentmihalyi calls the flow state, defined as a state of concentration and enjoyment so focused that it amounts to complete absorption in an activity. And we'll come back to that in a second. But for now, let me highlight that for myself and for MacIntyre, practices and the goods which are pursued through them gesture not only to themselves, but a way of life, the good of a certain kind of life. To live well, the life of a gardener, a farmer, a yogini, or we might ask a content creator. Pursuing goodness itself, yearned for in the particularity of the practice, but never exhausted by it. Institutions. Okay. One aspect of MacIntyre we have not touched on is institutions. He argues no practice can survive any length of time unsustained by institutions. They situate practices and practitioners within a history, define them via structures of authority, and regulate external goods by distributing power and status. Yet, as MacIntyre notes, institutions are corruptive, for the ideas and creativity of practices are always vulnerable to the acquisitiveness and competitiveness of the institution. Indeed, there is a relationship so intimate between practices and institutions, they often form a single causal order. So the question I want to pose then is, how do we understand practice and institutions in a digital age? For Marshall McLuhan's famous statement, "The medium is the message," begs us to consider the question, is digital media a technology or a practice? This is the vital paradox. Does digital technology act as a mean towards other or pre-existing goods, or does it in fact create new goods? One might argue that the digital helps continue timeless practices such as human communication, just with increased speed and access. Yet this is not the case. Digital media not only alters the structure of our lives, our day, our workflow, but also our brain chemistry and certainly our values. Enabled by the predecessors of post-structuralism and the cybernetic turn, in a digital age, we have become practitioners of our own lives. Performing identities, we are all content creators in some way, unless we are Luddites, creating self through symbols and simulacra, images and snapshots, signifiers of something. Indeed, digital technologies become extensions of ourselves, but what? More often than not, status and value, as we seek validation for the self we construct. Yet to follow McIntyre, we must ask, what does the artist, or in this case, content creator, discover within the pursuit of their excellence, the good of what kind of life? While one might posit that individuals seek individual realization to discover and realize their truest self, for monetary gain or otherwise, online, this answer is not quite satisfactory because it does not shed light on that deeper, ineffable experience of excellence or lack of it that McIntyre seeks to describe. I'm a little bit conscious of time. How long do I have left?
Come along.
Okay. It would be too easy to just criticize the value or good of individual self-realization, which McIntyre does, but actually this can be valid as a spiritual or ethical path when imbued with virtues such as compassion, charity, and love, as opposed to corrupted by arrogance, hubris, and idolatry. Returning to the intertwining of practices and institutions, as we have seen, practices are always vulnerable to the acquisitiveness and competition of the institutions. It is my argument that the digital is the epitome of this commodifying logic. Individualistic values or goods, such as success, freedom, and self-betterment, are increased by our ability to share, judge, and promote online, rewarded with followers, engagements, and likes. The shrinking of time and space via the digital encourages speed, action, and the proliferation of the image, or now the 90-second max clip, encouraging a culture of sharing, productivity, and urgency. Status and morality have first become hyper-individualized. As the self is commodified and atomized, there is also more individual responsibility. And we can probably all relate to at least half of the problems that so often arise: exhaustion, overwhelm, fragmented attention, comparing self to others, boredom, and even ADHD. So the digital world scatters our attention, and attention is the greatest commodity online. And even our attentive labors are sold to third parties, so we can be sold back to again. Yet, as Simone Weil has suggested, attention is not and should not be a commodity bought and sold as data and click-throughs. Rather, it is the prime good, the highest good, the excellence embodied by the master practitioner. For Weil, absolute unmixed attention is prayer. Yet in a digital age, if attention is prayer, who or what are we praying to? It would seem the internal commodifying logic of the digital as an institution has capitalized upon that prime good that transverses all practices, attention. For the digital is both an institution and a practice. The medium is the message, and the message is overpowering. As Simone Kopfer has argued, so much of modern philosophy focuses on the principle of effort in the pursuit of individual or spiritual realization, at the expense of effortlessness or grace. Practice, hard work, discipline, and dedication, aka effort, get you so far and are indeed important. But there is a point when all effort is overcome by effortlessness and something far greater is received. And here we can think of the gift. The issue then perhaps falls the other way in a digital age. We have become too accustomed to effortlessness. Returning to the notion of excellence and the flow state, we might recall that the psychologist I mentioned with the hard to pronounce name actually states flow is not always a good thing. I quote, "The flow experience, like everything else, is not good in an absolute sense. It is only good in that it has the potential to make life more rich, intense, meaningful. Whether instances of flow are good, in a larger sense, needs to be discussed and evaluated in terms of more inclusive social criteria." In a digital age, we might argue that it is just too easy to fall into a flow state. For the institution of the digital has taken over, its logic capitalizing upon our attention and our being. We scroll, flowing effortlessly, waiting for some kind of salvation to arrive that never comes. Pleasure becomes free labor. Consumption is productive and production is consumptive. And attention is the prime commodity in this machine. Okay, so I'm on to the conclusion now. So in this paper, I've argued that the intricate relationship between the practice of individual self-realization and the institution through which it operates, but it kind of at once is, the digital, has been corrupted via the commodifying logic of the digital. The medium is the message and the message is overpowering. The core virtue of all practice, which is at its source attention, understood theologically as prayer, has been sacrificed to an idol. We are sold a false promise of salvation, attained effortlessly without works, and receive a zombie-like condition that oscillates between flow and burnout. Yet what are we to make of these thoughts and the many loose ends that are yet to be tied? What is the solution for the modern crisis of virtue exacerbated online and the fragmentation of our attention that is so closely aligned with it? I just have a few final thoughts. So the first is communities and discussion. I think that online, this is why I kind of improvise a bit. I think online there's a lot of individual responsibility, and these things are so overpowering that we kind of need education in relation to virtue. How are we to act in the world? We need, discipline, right? And when you have kind of some discipline, it can really help you structure your life with much more ease. And for that, you need authority. And how do we get authority? Do we just listen to, ask the chatbot or ChatGPT for advice? Or do we come together in places like this to talk in community and actually think further? Secondly, obviously, we need time offline, connecting to real people and bodies, not just online. As the previous talk said so interestingly, relationships can become objectified online, especially when we have these transactions of status and symbol. And I really relate to that point. And we need to come back into rooms with people and with nature. And finally, laws and policy. As McIntyre writes, although it is the task of government to promote law abidingness, it is on the liberal view that no part of the legitimate function of government to inculcate one moral outlook. However, we are seeing, recently countries banning TikTok and more serious threats in regard to AI and media. So governmental injunction may be a good and necessary counter to the logic of the digital. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer.
I do have some questions. Thank you for this. It was really thoughtful.
So welcome.
I'm curious about so the virtues. Do you see them emerging from individuals as they discover their own digital practice, or is it going to be influenced through the top-down institutions or community structures? And it made me think about, are there certain community structures or formats for discussion and dialogue that lend itself best to these kind of virtue ethics relationships with digital practice? Like, are there certain kinds of structures, for example, that just wouldn't work for this?
Well, you know what? I'll give you a kind of anecdote, because for me, this is deeply personal. The whole interest, and probably for most of us, because digital is taking over our lives. But I also teach yoga, and see like the philosophical education and training I have as kind of part of that, and I want to pursue that together in some way. So online, I'm part of many communities where people are kind of like entrepreneurs in some way, and there's this kind of big movement of like kind of spiritual entrepreneurism. And while people are creating a community here to kind of boost their career and, you know, make money, ultimately I'm deeply skeptical of it, because I feel like it's got slightly distorted values, because it's kind of this idea that if you're pursuing spirituality, it's your birthright to, you know, be rich, basically. And that's kind of problematic. So I think maybe we need to take the community discussions like offline, and maybe, you know, go back to actually some sense of tradition or more traditional values in terms of thinking, you know, less capitalistically and like less about just making loads of money and, you know, entitlement, to kind of more, yeah, maybe humble values and virtues. Because yeah, I suppose, you know, my talk probably did generalize a bit, and there are lots of community spaces online where people do discuss stuff, but I think it can be problematic, especially this culture with so many people producing content, trying to get attention, you know, fake it till you make it, the stuff like that. So yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question about attention. You very wisely noted that many traditional practices of prayer, meditation are based around attention, or what we might think of mindfulness, and the very nature of media or social media is a competition for our attention. But of course, increasingly, the types of social media that we engage with are moving towards shorter form, like sort of be on TikTok. In an attention economy, can we ever view media, these types of digital social medias as a space where we can meditate and extend our attention towards something which is more transcendental?
Great question. I'll also just give a quick other anecdote. Yeah, like I think in some way you need kind of leaders and followers, like you need a teacher, obviously. So spaces like discussion groups online where people are actually kind of engaging in circles and education can be really powerful. But even people leading meditation online can be really powerful. Actually, you can often get into a deeper state, because so often when you're in a kind of yoga or meditation class, you know, after the class it's a bit like socially awkward, because you kind of like don't want to socialize too much, or maybe you do. And it's kind of like there's a lot at stake there. Whereas when you're in your room and someone's leading it, it's quite chilled out. But I do think you need kind of leaders you need someone guiding you in that space. Yeah, and then there's always the, you know, like there can be not bad people, but people, the dodgy people maybe. Yeah, okay. If you have a question, maybe if we run out of time, you can ask me in the break, or I don't know if we have time.
Any more questions?
We did wrapping our question.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
I was like, I was trying to hurry up for your thought.
Very short.
Oh yeah.
I'm so glad that you did this talk, because I've been fascinated by like I must confess, like my knowledge of virtue ethics is older. It's like Aristotelian, and almost the idea of being on TikTok for 3 hours a day, creating these new habits of virtue in you. And the thing I wanted to ask you about was in the Aristotelian ideas, and so I don't know more about modern stuff, you have this idea of the eudaimonia, right? So this state of excellence that you're seeking. And I feel actually our engagement with social media every day is actually making the eudaimonic point more prevalent in our minds. And I just wondered what you thought about the digital sort of making the eudaimonic state almost like the desire of the moth to the star, you know. It's more prevalent in our minds, but it's also less
Yeah, I mean, Michal, the psychologist, talks about flow. That's kind of seen as the psychology of happiness.
Yeah.
So it's very much about that kind of eudaimonic state. And similarly, have you heard of like the pleasure principle? I think that's by maybe Freud or maybe the other guy. But yeah, this idea that actually it's more, you know, we're more responsive, and especially on a chemical level, right, to these like feel-good hormones that trigger when we get that buzz. And we are much more reactive, I think, and in some ways more vulnerable to the phone and to kind of the response, especially I think if you're kind of a content creator who's trying to, you know, make something of yourself, because we do have this idea that, you know, actually the guy writes in the book Flow that anything else we want is secondary. So if we're thinking about secondary goods, you know, status, wealth, validation from others, that's secondary to the core thing we want is happiness. And that is the notion of the good. But how do we define our happiness? You know, we're so used to just instant gratification. So maybe that's why it's coming together and discussing virtue and ultimately having time off the screen, i.e. in nature, that we actually get a bit more space to experience that kind of expansive like happiness without it being like, yes, yes, yes. Yeah. Okay, cool.